In the silent hallway of the elite school, cruel laughter echoes, and the white cane wavers before a trap. Before the fall happens, the nanny appears, firm as a shield, facing the bullies. For a moment, she thinks she has won. But when the millionaire father arrives, the air changes. He doesn't shout, he doesn't react, he just watches and makes a decision that will make everyone in that school wonder who, after all, is truly in the dark. The laughter exploded like unwarranted fireworks in the blue hallway of the elite Crestwood Academy in Atlanta. A sharp, cruel sound that cut the air with the precision of broken glass. Eleanor, Ellie, 10 years old, and perceiving the universe through her fingertips and the echo of sounds, felt the floor vibrate with the cackles even before the teenage voice whispered, "Poisonous and close. Take a spill, blind girl." Her white cane, an extension of her inquisitive body, tapped the polished floor with familiar confidence, but found a soft, unexpected obstacle. A backpack, placed there like a cowardly trap. The loss of balance was immediate. A flash of panic where the world seemed to tilt sideways. Before fear could fully bloom into a fall, however, a firm, warm hand wrapped around her wrist. Lena, the nanny, moved with the speed of protective instinct, her body leaping forward to steady the girl's stance. With Ellie secure beside her, Lena straightened and faced the small group of impeccable uniforms. The air, previously filled with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the comforting aroma of freshly baked croissants wafting from the cafeteria, now felt heavy, dense. The silence that settled was crushing, loaded with guilt and expectation. It was at that exact moment that a man rounded the corner of the hallway. Richard, Rich, wore a tailored charcoal grey suit, and his gaze, trained to decipher the coldness of spreadsheets and contracts, captured the entire scene in a fraction of a second. He saw Lena posted like a silent shield, his daughter, Ellie, with trembling lips and a pale face, the classmates frozen, caught between defiance and apprehension, and lurking behind them, almost like a shadow on the wall, the academic coordinator, Ms. Harrington, pretending to adjust papers on her clipboard. Her eyes deliberately diverted from the confrontation. In that instant, in the core of Richard, the injustice that would move everything was born. He knew, with the clarity of a final balance sheet, that the school, generously sponsored by his company, Sideral Tech, preferred to bury the incident rather than protect the one who needed it most. He was a methodical man, a protector who had learned to solve life's problems with phone calls and the weight of his influence. He tasted the bitter flavor of old guilt in his mouth, the guilt for having outsourced Ellie's care after the loss that left him functional but emotionally distant. His defense mechanism had always been control of numbers, schedules, and himself. He looked at Lena, the discreet, resilient woman who had become his daughter's eyes and security, and saw something his financial reports couldn't predict. A quiet, unshakable strength. A strength that he, with all his capital, seemed to have lost. He analyzed her posture, the way her body subtly leaned to shield Ellie, the absence of fear in her gaze. It was a reaction he admired, but it also shamed him. Why wasn't he the one there, the first to defend her? The coordinator, sensing Richard's imposing presence, finally lifted her face, a poorly rehearsed mask of surprise forming on her features. She opened her mouth to say something, to dilute the tension with a pedagogical banality, but Richard's voice cut her off, sounding low and dangerously calm in the silent corridor. He didn't look at the teenagers. He didn't look at his daughter. His eyes were fixed on the coordinator, and every word was a precise blow. "Miss Harrington," he said, the polite tone barely hiding the steel underneath. "I would like to have a conversation in your office. Now. And you," he added, turning minimally to Lena. "Come with me, you and Eleanor." Ms. Harrington's office was an aquarium of order and silence. The walls, painted an impersonal beige, boasted framed diplomas and certificates. silent witnesses to an authority built on rules and procedures. Richard sat in the leather chair opposite the polished mahogany desk, his body rigid, his executive briefcase resting beside him like a weapon in repose. Beside him, Lena settled Ellie in a smaller chair, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder, a point of contact that transmitted security amidst the sterility of the environment. Ellie, in turn, kept her head slightly tilted, as if she could hear the textures of the tension in the air. Richard wasted no time with formalities. His voice was the same one he used in board meetings, precise and devoid of emotion. He narrated what he saw in the hallway, every detail a piece of the accusation. He expected an immediate reaction, a promise of exemplary disciplinary action. After all, his company didn't just sponsor the school. His annual investment guaranteed the modernization of the labs and competitive salaries. His money, his fortune, was a fundamental part of that institution. He viewed the school as one of his many assets, and he expected a clear return, his daughter's safety and well-being. What he got, however, was a ballet of evasions. Ms. Harrington laced her fingers together on the desk and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Richard, I perfectly understand your concern," she began, her voice a practiced velvet. "But we need to be cautious. Most of the time, these incidents are just misunderstandings between peers. Bad jokes, of course, but without the intention to harm." Richard felt a wave of heat rise up his neck. A joke? Calling my daughter blind girl and setting her up to fall is a joke. The coordinator sighed, adopting an air of pedagogical patience. "We will investigate and, of course, we will talk to those involved, with discretion. I only ask for a little secrecy for the sake of everyone's image. A scandal wouldn't help anyone, especially considering our partnership." Lena remained silent, but her gaze didn't waver. She watched the coordinator and saw a pattern she knew well: the protection of the powerful, the minimization of the vulnerable's pain. It was a dynamic she had faced her entire life. She looked at Richard and saw frustration sparking in his eyes. He, a man accustomed to moving the world with a phone call, was being entangled in a web of bureaucracy and convenience. He, the billionaire, was discovering that his capital couldn't buy instant dignity for his daughter. "The most prudent thing," Miss Harrington continued, sensing she was gaining ground, "would be for Eleanor to stay home for a few days, just until the dust settles. We will provide her with the homework assignments, of course." That was the last straw. The suggestion of hiding the victim to appease the aggressors caused something to snap inside Lena. For the first time, she spoke, her voice calm, but with a weight that silenced the other two. "And Eleanor returns to class tomorrow," she said, without preamble. The sentence hung in the air, a direct challenge. Richard turned to her, surprised. That wasn't the reaction he expected. His instinct was to yank Ellie out, envelop her in protection, build a wall around her. But Lena was proposing the opposite: resistance. He looked at his daughter, expecting to see fear or hesitation, but found something different. Ellie turned her face toward Lena's voice and, with a firmness that mirrored the nanny's, nodded slightly. In that instant, Richard realized he was no longer in control of the situation. The decision of how to fight this battle was no longer just his. He was faced with a silent, powerful alliance, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what step to take next. The ride back home was filled with a dense silence, which even the constant traffic noise on the downtown connector couldn't dissipate. Richard drove his luxury sedan with the automatic precision of someone who knew the way by heart, but his mind was far from the lane changes and the hum of tires on the asphalt. It was trapped in the coordinator's beige office, replaying the conversation, the frustration growing like interest on an unpaid debt. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Ellie in the back seat, quiet, her headphones transporting her to her audiobooks, a safe refuge. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Lena looked out the window, the Atlanta urban landscape passing in a blur. She seemed calm, But Richard was beginning to understand that her calm was not the absence of feeling, but a control forged in battles he couldn't even imagine. It was he who broke the silence, his voice rougher than intended. "You were very firm in there," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I appreciated that." He expected a thank you, a modest nod. What came, however, was an answer that completely disarmed him. Lena turned her face to him, and there was a glint of irony in her eyes. "Courage without consequence is just cheap talk, Mr. Richard." The sentence hit him with the force of an inconvenient truth. He, a man whose net worth was discussed in business columns, who diversified his investments between the stock market, real estate funds, and even volatile cryptocurrency, was accustomed to acting by proxy. His consequences were numbers on a screen, profits or losses in dollars and euros. Her consequences were real, palpable, experienced on the skin. The spark between them was born not of attraction, but of friction, the collision of two worlds occupying the same physical space, but operating under completely different laws. They arrived at the underground garage of the luxury building in the Buckhead neighborhood. A fine, late afternoon rain began to fall, and the smell of ozone and wet concrete invaded the car as soon as he turned off the engine. As always, Lena was the first to get out to help Ellie. Richard followed immediately, driven by a new impulse to participate, not to just be the distant provider. Lena was already unfolding the girl's cane, a fluid and practiced gesture. He reached out to help, to take the object and hand it over, a small act of service. But her hand was already there. For a fleeting instant, their fingers touched. Her skin was soft, his marked by the habit of holding expensive pens and closing deals. It was minimal contact, almost accidental, but it sent an unexpected wave of heat up Richard's arm. He withdrew his hand as if he had touched something forbidden. Lena also recoiled, her face flushing slightly. She focused on adjusting Ellie's backpack strap, avoiding his gaze, erecting the barrier of formality between them again. She was the employee. He was the employer. An abyss of money and power separated them, and she wouldn't allow herself to forget it. It was Ellie who broke the spell. Without realizing what had happened, she took a deep breath and smiled. "The smell of rain arrived," she said, her clear voice echoing in the silent garage. "We could order some soup tonight, to celebrate that I'm going to school tomorrow." Richard looked at his daughter, then at Lena, who was now smiling at the girl. A genuine smile that transformed her face. The tension dissipated, but something had changed. He felt the need to reaffirm his role, to show that he was still in command of the situation, that his way of resolving things would prevail. "We are going tomorrow," he said, his tone decisive. "But first, I'll make a few calls. No one disrespects my daughter and gets away with it. I'll handle this my way." The next morning was grey and humid. The Atlanta sky seeming to reflect the mood in Richard's penthouse. He woke up before the sun, driven by a cold, controlled fury. He sat in his private office, a sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the sleeping city, and began to do what he did best, activate the gears of power. The first call was to the chairman of the school board, an old acquaintance from golf rounds and business dinners. Richard was direct, his voice sharp like the sound of a stock plummeting. He spoke about negligence, the need for exemplary action, and the institution's responsibility. The response, however, was a dose of empty cordiality and vague promises. "We'll look into it, Richard, of course. But you know how these things are. We need to follow protocol." The second call was to his lawyer, exploring the legal ramifications, the possibility of using the sponsorship contract as leverage. Again, he hit a wall of caution. Breaking an image contract would require irrefutable proof and could generate unwanted liability for his businesses. For the first time in years, Richard felt that his vast wealth, his immense fortune, was useless. Money could buy companies, influence markets, but it couldn't bend the complicit bureaucracy of a private school. Meanwhile, in Ellie's room, a contrasting scene of tranquility unfolded. Lena helped the girl get dressed, her movements calm and efficient. On the bed lay a new book, hardback with the title in relief. The Adventures of Leah Through the World of Sounds, Ellie read, her fingers gliding over the braille dots. Lena sat beside her and, with disconcerting naturalness, began to read a passage aloud, following the text with her fingertips, which moved over the pages with the same fluency. Richard's eyes scanned a dividend report. He stopped at the bedroom door, drawn by the voices, and observed the scene in silence. He didn't know. In all the months Lena had worked for him, he never knew she mastered Braille. He presumed she was just a competent caregiver, not someone with such a specific and profound skill. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a mixture of admiration and shame for his own ignorance. In the car, on the way to school, silence was again the main passenger. Richard, still churning over the impotence of his calls, felt Ellie's presence beside him. "Dad," she said suddenly, "did you know the blue hallway has a different echo near the music room? The sound gets rounder, and I know exactly where Liam's locker is. It's 12 long steps past the library door. The floor creaks a little there." Richard turned to her, stunned. His daughter, whom he saw as fragile and in need of his protection, had created a mental map of her environment, an architecture of sounds and sensations. She wasn't just surviving that place, she was mastering it in her own way. When they arrived at the school entrance, the air seemed to thin. The group of teenagers was there, near the gate, trying to look indifferent. Ms. Harrington, however, emerged as if on standby, a tight smile on her face. She approached the car and asked Richard for a word in private. "Mr. Richard," she began in a low voice, while Lena helped Ellie get out. "I talked to the boys. There's a delicate detail. The boy who put the backpack in the way, Liam. He is Arthur's son, your head of logistics at Sidral Tech, a 20-year employee. The boy is on scholarship." The information dropped onto Richard with the weight of an anvil, shattering his plans for retaliation. The injustice now had a face, a name, and a direct connection to the empire he had built. The coordinator's revelation worked like a short circuit in Richard's brain. Arthur, his head of logistics, a loyal and efficient man whom he himself had promoted twice. His son. The situation, already complex, had just become a snarl of conflicting loyalties and unpredictable consequences. Any drastic action against the boy would directly affect a valuable employee, a man whose family depended on the job at Sidral Tech. It was the cruel irony of Atlanta, a metropolis with a small-town soul, where everyone, from the billionaire to the blue-collar worker, eventually crosses paths. Ms. Harrington watched Richard's reaction, her small, calculating eyes registering his hesitation. She knew she had played the right card. The school, now, was protected by the complexity of human and corporate relations, a type of armor more effective than any contract. Richard merely nodded, mute, and watched Lena and Ellie move toward the entrance. Lena's posture was erect, Ellie's confident, her cane scoring the ground with new determination. They didn't look back. In that moment, he felt like a complete outsider in his own battle. He, the man whose businesses moved millions of dollars, was paralyzed. Lena, with her quiet resilience, and Ellie, with her map of echoes and steps, seemed much more prepared for that war than he with all his wealth. During the rest of the week, an uncomfortable pattern settled. Richard plunged into work, seeking refuge in the familiarity of numbers, cash flow projections, and asset negotiations. It was a territory where he had control, where variables were logical. But the image of his daughter and the nanny facing the school alone haunted him. He tried to compensate for his absence with gifts, with orders for Ellie's favorite dinner to be prepared, gestures that seemed increasingly empty. Lena, in turn, became the bridge between father and daughter. She narrated the small victories of the day to Richard, how Ellie answered a geography question accurately, guided by the auditory memory of a documentary, how she taught a classmate the Braille alphabet using grains of rice during lunch. They were small victories, but in Lena's narrative, they gained the weight of great achievements. The intimacy between the three began to grow in unexpected spaces, in the daily moments Richard usually delegated. One Saturday afternoon, the strong autumn sun invited them out. Lena suggested Piedmont Park. Richard, reluctant to leave his spreadsheets, eventually yielded to the silent request on his daughter's face. They sat on a bench under tall palm trees, while Lena read to Ellie, describing the architecture of the old buildings. Ellie interrupted. "The wind is different here," she said. "In the other trees, it whistles. In these tall palms, it sounds like it's sighing." Richard looked at the treetops, then at his daughter, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't just hear the words, but felt what they meant. He heard the sigh of the wind. That night, something else shifted. Richard went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Lena preparing tea. She wore simple clothes, sweatpants and a t-shirt, the nanny uniform put away. Without the formality of the attire, she looked different, younger, and more vulnerable. "She's sleeping soundly," Lena said, guessing his silent question, dreaming of sighing palms. He thanked her, but didn't leave. He stood there, leaning against the marble counter, and asked the question that had bothered him since the morning in Ellie's room. "Where did you learn Braille?" Lena shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of a long history. "In public libraries. When I was a teenager, I needed a quiet place to escape the noise at home. I ended up befriending a blind boy. He taught me." She paused, her eyes fixed on the teacup. "People like me learn early that, to have a chance, we need to know things others don't expect us to know." The confession, said with disarming simplicity, hit Richard. He began to realize that Lena wasn't just an employee. She was a universe of experiences and resilience that he had barely begun to glimpse. And, dangerously, he found himself wanting to discover more. The arrival of Camille was like a gust of cold wind on an already cloudy day. She appeared at the door of Richard's penthouse on a Tuesday evening, announcing her presence with the sharp sound of expensive heels on the marble floor. Richard's ex-fiancée, Camille, was a socialite with the calculated beauty of a marketing piece, a woman who transformed every social event into a business opportunity. Now, she had been hired by the school to organize the annual charity gala, a position that placed her back in his orbit. A coincidence Richard suspected had been carefully orchestrated. "Richie, darling," she purred, depositing an air kiss near his cheek, the expensive perfume filling the room. Her eyes, however, quickly passed over him and landed on Lena, who was helping Ellie with her homework at the large dining table. Camille's gaze was a quick, cold assessment, a calculation of status and threat. She saw the simple uniform, the discreet posture, and immediately catalogued her as irrelevant. "And this is the caregiver?" she asked, the dismissive tone barely disguising the disdain. Lena merely raised her eyes for a second, a restrained nod, and returned her attention to Ellie, creating a bubble of normalcy around the girl. Richard felt immediate discomfort. Camille's presence, with her studied superficiality, seemed to desecrate the atmosphere of quiet complicity that had settled in his home. He led her to the office, anxious to keep the conversation focused on business, the sponsorship, the gala. But Camille had other plans. "I heard about the little incident," she said, sitting in the leather armchair as if it were a throne. "A delicate situation. The school's image is a valuable asset, and Sideral Tech is directly linked to it. Any scandal could affect investors' perception, your stock prices." She spoke his language, the cold language of capital, but her words had a clear target. "That nanny, she seems a little passionate. Sometimes, simple people take advantage of situations like this to gain attention, to create drama. You need to be careful, darling. Protect your assets, your image. While she spoke, another antagonist moved in the shadows. Owen, Richard's minority partner, an ambitious man who had long coveted a larger stake in the business, saw an opportunity in the school incident. In a board meeting, he raised the issue, disguising his intention under a mask of concern. "Richard, this story with the school is taking on an inappropriate proportion," he said, his voice grave. "It's diverting your focus. Perhaps it's time for me to take the lead on the sponsorship, handle the institutional relations. You need to focus on what really matters: international expansion, the new investment funds." It was a subtle blow, an attempt to undermine Richard's authority by using his personal life against him. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The coordinator, Miss Harrington, eyeing a promotion to regional director, reinforced the narrative of the isolated case, assuring all influential parents that the situation was under control and that discretion was the best policy. She feared that any noise could frighten away the substantial donations that kept her job secure. That same evening, after Camille's departure, Richard found Lena in the kitchen, packing Ellie's lunch for the next day. The silence between them was different now, heavy with the day's tensions. "She didn't like me," Lena said, without pretense, without lifting her eyes from the fruit she was cutting. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "Camille lives in a world where people are evaluated by what they appear to be, not by what they are," Richard replied, feeling the need to defend Lena, to distance himself from Camille's world. "She is not a threat." Lena finally looked up at him, and there was a sad wisdom in her eyes. "People like her are always a threat, Mr. Richard. They don't need motives, only opportunities. And to her, I am the type of person who shouldn't exist in her world." She closed the lunchbox with a soft click, a definitive sound. "Good night." And she left, leaving Richard alone in the immense kitchen, the echo of her words reverberating in his mind. He realized that the battle was no longer just about an act of bullying in the school hallway. It was a collision of values, a silent confrontation that was forcing him to choose which side he truly stood on. The first week turned into two, and a fragile routine began to crystallize in the penthouse. Richard, for the first time, started arriving home before Ellie went to sleep. He didn't actively participate in the Braille readings, but sat in the armchair across the room, his laptop on his lap, pretending to work. In truth, he listened. He heard Lena's voice bring pirates and explorers to life, heard Ellie's laughter when a character stumbled, and felt the comfortable silence that settled between the two at the end of chapters. These were moments his immense capital couldn't buy. Small applications of time that generated an emotional return he didn't know. He felt himself thawing, the ice shell of the functional, distant man beginning to crack. He believed, for a brief moment, that the situation at school was settling, that Lena's firmness and Ellie's resilience had won the battle quietly. He was mistaken. The turning point did not come with a phone call or a formal meeting. It arrived in the form of a link, sent without comment by his head of communications on Wednesday of the second week. The message simply said, "Urgent. This is in all the parents' groups and starting to appear on local blogs." Richard clicked. His smartphone screen filled with the shaky image of the school's blue hallway. The quality was amateur, clearly filmed by a hidden phone. The video did not show the trap, did not capture the cruel whisper. The recording began a second later. At the exact instant Lena supported Ellie, pulling her into a firm, protective hug. The camera zoomed in, and what was seen was devastatingly intimate. Ellie's face buried in Lena's shoulder, relief and fear dissolving into security. Lena's hand stroking the girl's hair, her lips moving, whispering inaudible words that were visibly a balm. The video lasted only 15 seconds, but it contained a universe of tenderness and strength. A sensitive student, wanting to register the counterpoint to the cruelty he witnessed, posted it with the caption, "Some people really care." The internet did the rest. Within hours, the 15 seconds of pure humanity became a symbol. It was shared hundreds, then thousands of times. Mothers, fathers, teachers, people who knew nothing of the story, commented on the beauty of the gesture. Lena, the anonymous nanny, was transformed into the silent heroine of a narrative the public filled with their own imagination. Richard felt a fierce pride swell in his chest. It was the proof, the validation of everything. But the pride lasted only briefly. The phone rang. It was Ms. Harrington. Her voice was no longer velvety. It was icy, sharp. "Mr. Richard, I imagine you've seen the video. This is an unacceptable breach of protocol. The exposure of the student, the posture of your employee. This is amateurism, a lack of professionalism that the school cannot tolerate." Richard could barely process the words. Professionalism. She was protecting my daughter. She was creating a scene, the coordinator retorted. And now that scene stains the institution's image. "I demand a meeting with Ms. Lena tomorrow at 8. And I suggest you take the appropriate measures regarding her employment contract." The call ended. Richard's pride converted into fury. But underneath the fury, a current of cold panic began to flow. Camille's and Owen's words returned to his mind. The scandal, the image, the stocks. He looked at the video again, at the hug the world saw as love, and that the school now painted as a crime. That night, he waited for Lena to finish tucking Ellie into bed. He found her in the hallway, her face tired but serene. He didn't know how to start, how to explain that the most beautiful gesture he had seen in years was being twisted into a weapon to destroy her. He merely raised his phone, the screen still glowing with the image of the embrace. "Lena," he said, his voice low, laden with a weight she didn't immediately comprehend. "The school saw this. They are accusing you of lack of professionalism. They want me to take action." Lena looked at the phone screen Richard held. Her shoulders, for an instant, seemed to give way, as if an invisible weight had finally found her. But there was no panic on her face, only an ancient exhaustion, the familiarity of someone who had been in this exact place before. She didn't look at the embrace, but at her own reflection in the dark screen, the woman in uniform, the employee, the disposable piece in others' game. "They always do this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "They take something good and turn it into something dirty to justify their own cowardice." The next day, the meeting in Ms. Harrington's office was a lesson in passive aggression. The coordinator was not alone. Beside her sat the school's lawyer, a man with the impassive face of someone who charged by the hour to say no. Ms. Harrington presented her argument, not with anger, but with calculated disappointment. She spoke about the improper exposure of a minor, the need to maintain a professional environment, but the final blow came in the form of a folder. The lawyer opened it and pointed to a clause in the sponsorship contract Richard had signed years ago and barely remembered. Clause 12. B explicitly prohibited any kind of scandal or negative media exposure involving employees directly linked to scholarship or sponsored students, under penalty of review or suspension of the agreement. And there was the trap. Technically, as Richard's employee, Lena was linked to Ellie, and the video, although positive to the public, had been classified by the school as a negative exposure to its image. Richard felt the floor open up. They had twisted the logic using his own contract, his own money, as a weapon against him. The message was clear. Silence your employee or your valuable investment is at risk. On the way home, he was silent, his mind working at high speed, calculating risks and losses, as if analyzing a stock market crash. He fell into his default mode, damage control. That night, He called Lena to his office. He tried to be careful, using the tone of a concerned manager, not that of an employer issuing an order. "Lena, the situation is more complex than I thought," he began, his hands clasped over the mahogany desk. "Dune, they are using the contract against us, to protect you, to protect Eleanor. I think the best thing would be for you to step away for a while, just until the dust settles. I would continue to pay your full salaries, of course. You wouldn't have any financial loss." He thought the solution was logical, elegant, a strategic retreat. But for Lena, those words were like salt in an open wound. She stared at him, and for the first time, he saw not only strength but pain in her eyes. "Financial loss," she repeated, her voice low and trembling with contained anger. "You think this is about money?" She took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists by her sides. "When the powerful want silence, simple women pay the price. I am not a problem to be managed, Mr. Richard. I am not a liability on your spreadsheet. I am a person." He recoiled, hurt by the direct attack, by the pride of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. "I am just trying to protect you," he said, his voice rising. "Protect?" She laughed, a joyless sound. "You know nothing about protecting me." She took a deep breath, and the revelation that followed changed everything, realigning the past and present into a brutal straight line. "I was a student at this school, Mr. Richard, on scholarship 15 years ago. And after an episode of discrimination that was never acknowledged, I was invited to withdraw. The person who signed my forced transfer to avoid bigger problems was Ms. Harrington." Lena's confession hung in the sumptuous air of the office, sucking all the oxygen. Her words didn't just explain her resilience, they redrew the map of that battle. Richard looked at her and no longer saw just his daughter's nanny. He saw a wounded teenager, a young woman forced into silence, a woman whose scar was being pressed by the same hand that caused it. He realized with sickening clarity that it wasn't an isolated case of bullying. It was a pattern, a system of silent oppression that his fortune, his assets, and his businesses helped sustain. His logical solution of asking her to step away now seemed monstrous, a repetition of the same injustice she had suffered years ago. His anger toward the school turned into shame for himself. He, the multi-millionaire, the man of action, had offered money and exile as a solution, when what she needed was an ally. The fragile connection that had grown between them shattered. "Lena, I didn't know," he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The excuse of ignorance was the last refuge of the privileged. "No, you didn't know," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion now, which was infinitely worse than anger. "And that's why you can't help me." She turned and left the office, leaving behind a silence that was an accusation. In the days that followed, the penthouse became a territory of invisible borders. Richard and Lena moved like diplomats from enemy nations, exchanging only essential information about Ellie. He threw himself into work with renewed fury, trying to find in numbers an order that real life denied him. He sold a stagnant stock position, reviewed the profitability of his funds, but the feeling of impotence followed him from the office home. Lena, in turn, raised her defenses. She carried out her tasks with impeccable efficiency, but the silent complicity, the shared smiles, disappeared. Her world had shrunk again, and she protected herself within it, as she had learned to do early on. The heavy atmosphere did not go unnoticed by Ellie. With her heightened senses, she read the tension in the air as if it were a score. She felt the hesitation in her father's steps when he passed Lena in the hallway. She heard the absence of warmth in Lena's voice when she answered his questions. "Are you two mad?" she asked one night, her voice small in the middle of the silent dinner. "No, honey," Richard replied, too quickly. "Of course not, sweetheart," Lena said, simultaneously. The lack of synchronicity between them only confirmed the girl's suspicion. She shrank in her chair, her appetite suddenly gone. That night, Ellie had a nightmare and woke up calling for Lena. When Lena arrived at the room, the girl was sitting on the bed, her face bathed in tears and sweat. "I dreamed you were leaving," Ellie sobbed, clinging to the nanny. Lena hugged her tight, her heart aching with the girl's intuition. She calmed her with lullabies. But Ellie's words echoed in her mind like a prophecy. She couldn't stay there anymore. She couldn't fight for Ellie if, to do so, she had to erase herself, accept the protection that was just a more sophisticated form of silencing. At the end of the week, Lena made a decision. She waited for Richard to arrive from work and approached him in the hallway, the same place where he had shown her the video days before. Her posture was calm, her voice firm. "Mr. Richard, I would like to tender my resignation. I will fulfill the notice period, if you wish, until you find a replacement." Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. It was a professional, logical decision, but to him, it sounded like a final verdict on his failure. He was losing the only person who seemed to understand his daughter, the only person who had made him feel something real amidst his sterile life. And worst of all, he knew the fault was entirely his. The news of Lena's resignation fell upon the house like an untimely frost, freezing routine and hope. Richard tried to argue, offered a raise, more benefits, anything money could buy. He even mentioned the possibility of opening a small investment fund in her name, a desperate gesture to translate his plea into the only language he mastered. But Lena was unyielding. "It's not about the money, Mr. Richard," she said, for the second time, and the repetition of the phrase hurt him more each time. "It's about respect. I cannot work in a place where my presence is seen as a problem to be managed." The search for a replacement began. A parade of candidates sent by the city's best agency. They were qualified women with impeccable resumes and excellent references. But none of them were Lena. None of them knew Ellie liked her apple skin cut in a spiral. None of them understood the girl's map of sounds. Ellie, sensing the imminent loss, began to wilt. The vibrant girl who mapped the world with her ears became apathetic. She refused to go to the walks in Piedmont Park, lost interest in her audiobooks. She was sick with sadness, an illness no thermometer could measure. The voice guide who knew her pace, her rhythm, her heart, was leaving, and without her, the world seemed to have gone silent and dangerous. The tension in the house was almost unbearable. A dense silence, broken only by the essential sounds of life. Amidst this domestic Cold War, external antagonists saw their chance to advance. Owen, the partner, called an extraordinary meeting with the other investors. The situation with the school has become a liability for Sideral Tech's image, he argued, presenting graphs that showed a minimal but existing drop in positive brand mention on social media. I propose that the company withdraw the main sponsorship. I, personally, through one of my funds, can take over a smaller portion so as not to leave the institution completely unsupported. It would be a smooth transition that unlinks Richard's name, and consequently the company's, from all this confusion. It was corporate checkmate. He presented himself as the savior while isolating Richard and taking the prestige of the sponsorship for himself. Camille, in turn, acted behind the scenes. In a conversation with the director of the agency that had hired Lena, she was subtly venomous. Such a shame what happened with that nanny, Lena. So impulsive. A professional who lets emotion get the better of her can be a risk, don't you think? If I were you, I'd be very careful about recommending her to other families in our circle. The message was clear. A chilling recommendation in the market. A silent obstacle that would make it nearly impossible for Lena to get another job at the same level. The perfect injustice, executed with the precision of someone who doesn't need to dirty their hands. The third week of the conflict began with the perfect storm. On Monday, the school sent a formal notification citing Clause 12, B, and continuous negative exposure, they announced the unilateral termination of the sponsorship contract with Sideral Tech. On Tuesday, the employment agency called Lena, informing her that due to an internal portfolio restructuring, they could no longer represent her. Her name was practically on a blacklist. The all is lost moment arrived on a rainy Wednesday night. Richard was in his office, surrounded by contracts that now seemed useless, the termination announcement on his desk like an admission of defeat. Lena was in her room, packing her few belongings in a suitcase, the smell of cheap soap and broken dreams filling the air. It was then that a notification flashed on both their phones. It was an audio message sent by Ellie from her tablet. The small voice, surprisingly firm, filled the silence of both rooms. "Dad, Lena, I know you're mad. I hear your silence. Lena taught me that courage needs consequence, and Dad taught me that we don't give up on important things. You two are important. Please don't fight against each other. Fight together." The world seemed to shrink. The girl's voice pierced the walls, the defenses, the wounded pride. In the empty office, Richard felt the tears he hadn't cried in years burn in his eyes. In the small room, Lena stopped folding a shirt and hugged herself, the sound of the rain outside mixing with her own silent tears. A tiny, stubborn flame persisted in the darkness. Ellie's voice was the stone that, thrown onto the still surface of a lake, created ripples that propagated to the furthest shore. For Richard, that audio message was a catalyst, a solvent that dissolved the rigidity of years. He didn't sleep that night. He drove aimlessly through the sleeping city, the growl of his luxury car engine, the only sound in a silent world, and ended up, like so many restless hearts in Atlanta, on the edge of a reservoir or lake, watching the distant skyline. The lights of the city trembled on the dark water, and the cold air of the early morning seemed to clear his thoughts. There, observing the view that was a postcard of his city, he finally understood his conflict. His whole life, he had been a master at accumulating and managing assets, stocks, real estate, companies, even cryptocurrency and secure digital wallets. His net worth was not measured just in dollars or euros, but in control. He controlled his business, his cash flow, his image, and he had tried to do the same with love, turning the care of his daughter into a project, and the admiration for Lena into a problem to be contained. Loving, he realized, required the opposite. It demanded giving up control, accepting vulnerability, investing without guaranteed return. It required running the risk of an emotional liability. As the sky began to lighten, tinging a pale pink, the city woke up, and with it, small seeds of resistance began to sprout. The student who filmed the hug, a boy named Marcus, created a message group. In it, he added other classmates who, in silence, admired Lena, the sixth-grade girl she helped carry her books when her backpack strap broke, the boy on the basketball team to whom she discreetly gave an extra snack, knowing his family was struggling, a literature teacher, Ms. Miller, who had been leaving notes with Braille poems in Ellie's cubby, saw the group and offered herself as a witness, claiming to have reported the hallway hostility to Ms. Harrington weeks before, without response. The tide was turning. The movement culminated in a silent, powerful scene on Thursday afternoon in the pulsating heart of the city at Centennial Park. A small group of parents whose children had various specific needs and who felt invisible to the school administration gathered near a central monument. They did not shout slogans. They merely held small white canes, improvised with cardstock, in a gesture of silent solidarity that attracted more attention than any noisy protest. Richard, after his night of reflection, acted with the speed and decision that made him a billionaire. He called a meeting with Owen and the board. There was no discussion. He announced the termination of his partnership with the partner, buying his share with a premium that would silence him forever. Next, he drafted a press release, not from Sideral Tech, but from his personal foundation. He announced the creation of a high-capital inclusion fund, aimed at financing accessibility projects and anti-discrimination training in public and private schools across the city. And, in the final line, the boldest move, the fund would be coordinated by an expert in resilience and human care, Lina Batista, Camille. Upon hearing the news, called him, her voice hissing with fury. "Are you insane? You're mixing your personal life with business. You're going to destroy everything you built because of a nanny." Richard's response was calm, the voice of a man who had finally found his center. "On the contrary, Camille, for the first time in my life, I am aligning my values with my actions." He hung up before she could reply. He had done his public part. Now, the most difficult part remained. He needed to talk to her. He dialed the number he knew by heart. On the other end of the line, after 2 rings, a voice he feared he might never hear again, in a tone other than farewell, answered. "Hello." The invitation for the conversation was not made over the phone. Richard went to Lina's room door and knocked lightly. When she opened it, he saw the semi-packed suitcase beside the bed. A painful reminder of how close he was to losing her. Their eyes did not meet. "Lina," he said, his voice low, "I announced the creation of an inclusion fund. I would like you to coordinate it, with full autonomy and with a salary that reflects your competence, not your previous function." She didn't answer immediately. She leaned against the doorframe, her body expressing a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. He was offering an opportunity, a form of justice, but she knew the hidden price of the powerful's offers. "I read the statement," she said, finally. "It's a beautiful gesture, but I am not a symbol you can use to clean your conscience or your image." The accusation, though softly spoken, was direct and hit him squarely. "It's not about my image," he replied, sincerity making his voice hoarse. "It's about what is right. It's about what I should have done from the start." The school, feeling the pressure of public opinion and the humiliation of having lost its main sponsor, attempted a final maneuver. Ms. Harrington called Richard, her voice syrupy again, informing him that Ellie could return, but that, to ensure her safety, a new medical report and a series of psychopedagogical evaluations would be necessary. A bureaucratic barrier to delay the inevitable. It was the literature teacher, Ms. Miller, who delivered the final blow. She marched into the administration with a folder full of documents, copies of emails, meeting protocols, all proving that she and other teachers had, for months, warned about the hostile environment and requested referrals for students with socialization difficulties, all ignored by Miss Harrington. The coordinator, cornered, conceded. The parents' group from Centennial Park demanded the creation of a diversity and inclusion committee with active family participation, and the school, fearing a mass boycott, agreed. Lina then imposed her conditions. She sent a formal email to Richard with a copy to the foundation. She would accept the coordinator position, but the first contract he offered her was refused. Clause 7C, she wrote, requires confidentiality regarding any internal disagreements. That is unacceptable. My voice is no longer for sale. He rewrote the contract, eliminating any chains. Her second condition was the immediate hiring of mobility instructors for the public school system and the creation of an inclusive reading club, which would bear Ellie's name. He accepted without hesitation. Every victory exacted a price. Every step forward required a concession, an admission of error. Richard had to publicly admit, in an interview with a local newspaper, that his initial omission was a mistake, and that he, as a father and businessman, was learning to listen. The moment of greatest tension, however, did not happen in a meeting room or an interview. It happened in the penthouse kitchen, on a night when the rain beat against the window panes, the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Ellie was already asleep, They were alone, the space between them charged with everything that hadn't been said. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm afraid this is just an impulse, a passing whim of a rich man who felt guilty." Richard approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "The rich and guilty man would have given you severance and sent you away to avoid problems," he said, his eyes seeking hers. "I learned, Lena, that my whole life I knew how to add up companies and subtract people. Without you, I would have continued that way." He took a deep breath. "You are not a whim. You are the consequence I chose for my life." It was then that Ellie's door opened. The girl stood there, sleepy, holding her tablet. "I can't sleep," she said. "I found something. A file folder. It says drafts." She pressed a button. A video started playing. It was the same scene from the blue hallway, filmed from a different, closer angle. The audio was clearer. The teenager's voice saying, "Take a spill, blind girl," was distinct. But then, a small voice overlapped Ellie's voice, telling Marcus, the classmate who was filming, "Film something beautiful now. Film the hug. I want to show my dad that courage exists." The final revelation, delicate and powerful, settled upon them. It hadn't been chance, it had been intention. It was Ellie, the girl who didn't see with her eyes, but who saw everything, who orchestrated that moment of humanity to educate her father's heart. Ellie's voice, coming from the small tablet speaker, was the key that unlocked the last door between them. The video continued to play, but Richard and Lena no longer saw it. They looked at each other, and in the space between them, the truth finally settled, complete and crystalline. It wasn't just about the injustice suffered, but about the courage it inspired. It wasn't about a man saving a woman, but about a girl showing two adults how to be strong together. Richard knelt in front of his daughter, the height of his eyes finally level. "You did this. You asked Marcus to film." Ellie nodded, biting her lower lip. "I wanted you to see," she said, her voice low. "I heard you talking on the phone one day about stock profits, about having to be tough. I wanted you to see that being good is also being strong." The simple, direct words of a 10-year-old demolished Richard's last wall. He hugged her, not as a protector, but as a learner, his face buried in her hair, inhaling the scent of innocence and wisdom. Lena watched the scene, her heart overflowing with an emotion that was a mix of relief and profound love. She approached and placed her hand on Richard's shoulder, a gesture that sealed the truce and initiated a new treaty. The resolution of the conflicts unfolded naturally as a consequence of their choices. Mrs. Harrington was transferred to an administrative position with no contact with students, an early retirement disguised as a promotion. Camille, seeing that she had lost all influence, attempted a final media attack, but her voice sounded like someone who didn't understand the new times, and her venom dissolved in public indifference. The Inclusion Fund project, under Lena's coordination, took off. Her first initiative was to hire the blind boy who taught her Braille as a teenager to lead the reading workshops. She transformed her pain into purpose, her scar into a map to help others. Richard, in turn, learned the art of occupying less space and listening more. He sold his majority stake in Sidral Tech, keeping only a board seat, and channeled most of his inheritance and resources into the foundation. He discovered that the return on seeing a child learn to read with their fingers brought him more satisfaction than any stock market surge. The romance between him and Lena blossomed unhurriedly, built on the solid foundation of mutual respect. Their intimacy was found in small gestures, in hands that touched while reaching for a coffee cup, in the shared silence while listening to Ellie read aloud, in the laughter during the rehearsals for the school fair at the girls' new school, an inclusive public school they chose together. There was no more the formality of the uniform and the tie, only the complicity of two people who met in the midst of chaos. and decided to build an order of their own based on values that money could neither buy nor injustice destroy. The June air in Atlanta had the sweet smell of corn pudding and the warmth of school fair lights. Under a sky tinged with pink and orange, the yard of Ellie's new school buzzed with life. The music of an upbeat country folk band filled the air, mixing with the children's laughter and the parents' conversations. This was their new balance, established without silly euphoria, but with the solidity of something built on truth. Ellie, in a floral dress and braids, danced in the middle of the line, her steps guided by Lena's voice on one side and Richard's hand on the other. She didn't need to see the colorful banners to feel the joy vibrating in the air. Her laughter, loud and free, was the purest melody of that night. Richard, awkward in his dance steps, watched her with a feeling he had finally learned to name: serene happiness. He, who had spent his life accumulating a fortune in business and investments, understood now that a man's true net worth was measured by moments like that. His greatest treasure was not stored in gold or dollars, but in the sound of that laughter. Lena, now out of uniform, wearing comfortable jeans and a cotton top, was a serene center of gravity. She chatted with other parents, listened to Miss Miller's ideas for the reading club, and coordinated with the naturalness of someone born for it. In one moment, her eyes met Richard's over Ellie's head, and in the smile they exchanged, there was a universe of complicity. They hadn't defeated the world, but they were beginning to defeat it up close, step by step, stumble by stumble, with the mature certainty of those who learn to see beyond appearances. The next morning, the scene that sealed the transformation happened at the school gate. It was no longer the hostile blue hallway of an elite institution, but the vibrant gate of a school that pulsed with the city's diversity. Ellie got out of the car, picked up her cane, and, head held high, began to walk. The cane no longer tapped the ground with hesitation. It scored it with firmness, like someone signing their own path. Lena and Richard stayed behind, watching her. She was no longer being escorted, she was just being loved. Before entering, Ellie turned, a radiant smile on her face, and waved. It was a gesture of independence, of complete confidence in the world that awaited her. Richard put his arm around Lena's shoulders, and she nestled against him. They didn't say anything. Their silence was now one of peace, not tension. They watched Ellie join a group of friends, her voice blending with the others, part of a greater whole. The most important investment in Richard's life had not been in stocks or in any promising cryptocurrency, but in human dignity. And the return was infinite. The entire city seemed to breathe with them, a collective sigh of relief and hope. And finally, in that new beginning, under the Atlanta morning sun, one certainty hung in the air, as real as the smell of coffee coming from a nearby bakery. Now, truly, no one dares say, "Take a spill, blind girl," anymore.